Putin's Revenge, The Fight for the Border, by Whitney. Quote, "We have received additional information confirming that the oil controlled by Islamic State militants enters Turkish territory on an industrial scale. We have every reason to believe that the decision to down our plane was guided by a desire to ensure the security of this oil's delivery routes to ports where they are shipped in tankers." Russian President Vladimir Putin, Paris, November 30, 2015. By Mike Whitney for Counterpunch on Information Clearinghouse on December 1, 2015. On Monday, the remains of Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Peskov were flown to Moscow, where he was met by the Russian Minister of Defense, the head of the Russian Air Force, family members, and a full military drill team. Peskov will be buried with honors and receive the Russian Federation's highest award, the Medal of Valor, for his service in fighting U.S.-backed terrorist groups in Syria. Peskov's Su-24 was ambushed last Tuesday by a Turkish F-16 when he allegedly drifted into Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. The surprise attack, which was not preceded by any warning, forced the pilot to eject, after which he was shot and killed while descending in his parachute. The anti-regime militant who claims to have killed Peskov in a Turkish ultra-nationalist named Alparslan Çelik, who is a leader in the Grey Wolves, a terrorist organization that has, quote, carried out scores of political murders since 1970s. Çelik's group of, quote, moderate jihadis is one of many disparate militias that are supported by both the U.S. and Turkey in their effort to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and splinter the country into smaller parts. The downing of the Su-24 has not triggered the knee-jerk reaction from Moscow that many had expected. Instead, it has focused Putin's attention on his ultimate goal of defeating terrorism in Syria and maintaining the sovereign integrity of the state. Putin has boosted Russia's military presence to 69 Sukhoi fighter jets, 160 bombers, as well as submarines and warships located in the Mediterranean Sea. He has also deployed the S-400 anti-aircraft defense system to Latakia and ordered the Moskva guided missile cruiser to remain within firing distance off the coast of Syria. The downing of the Russian warplane has only intensified Putin's determination to seal the northern border, defeat the terrorists, and win the war in Syria. This is clearly not the reaction Washington was hoping for. In candid remarks to the Russian media, Putin implicated the U.S. in the downing of the Su-24, stating that the U.S. military was briefed on the warplane's flight path and then immediately passed along that information to Turkey. Here's what he said. Quote, "We told our U.S. partners in advance where, when, and what altitudes our pilots were going to operate. The U.S.-led coalition, which includes Turkey, was aware of the time and place where our planes would operate. And this is exactly where and when we were attacked. Why did we share this information with the Americans? Either they don't control their allies, or they just pass this information left and right without realizing what the consequences of such actions might be. We will have to have a serious talk with our U.S. partners." Putin's damning remarks have not appeared in any of the Western media. The censorship of this information is similar to the blackout of comments Putin made just 2 weeks earlier at the G20 summit, where he announced that, quote, 40 countries are financing ISIS, including members of the G20. Here's an excerpt of Putin's bombshell announcement. Quote, "I provided examples based on our data on the financing of different Islamic State units by private individuals. This money, as we have established, comes from 40 countries, and there are some of the G20 members among them," Putin told the journalists. Quote, I've shown our colleagues photos taken from space and from aircraft which clearly demonstrate the scale of the illegal trade in oil and petroleum products. The motorcade of refueling vehicles stretched for dozens of kilometers, so that from a height of 4,000 to 5,000 meters, they stretch beyond the horizon. Putin added, comparing the convoy to gas and oil pipeline systems. Putin, ISIS financed from 40 countries including G20 members, RT. Don't look for this story in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post. You won't find it. It's not in the interest of the major media to publish information that suggests that Washington and its allies are providing material support for terrorist organizations. It's clear that Russia's bombardment of jihadi groups operating near the Turkish-Syrian border has Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan worried. Erdogan has long hoped that the area would be turned into a safe zone where Sunni militants, committed to removing Assad from power, could receive weapons and other support from their sponsors, while coming and going as they pleased. The Russian-led coalition's attempt to retake the area and seal the border to stop the flow of terrorists from Turkey is probably what precipitated the attack on the Russian warplane. It was a desperate attempt to wave off the Russian offensive and reverse the course of the war, which has turned decisively in Assad's favor. As for the militant groups that are operating in this area, analyst Pepe Escobar sums it up like this in a recent post at Sputnik News. Quote, the Su-24s were actually after Chechens and Uzbeks, plus a few Uyghurs, smuggled in with fake Turkish passports. Chinese intel is also on it. All of these operating in tandem with a nasty bunch of Turkish Islamo-fascists. Most of these goons transit back and forth between the CIA weaponized Free Syrian Army, FSA, and Jabhat al-Nusra. These were the goons who machine-gunned the Russian pilots as they parachuted down after the hit on the Su-24. Turkey, for all practical purposes, has been a handy, sprawling, Salafi jihadi infrastructure and logistics center. It offers everything from porous borders, enabling countless jihadi return tickets from Syria to Europe, facilitated by corrupt police, to a convenient crossroads for all kinds of smuggling and a hefty money laundering ops. Sultan Erdogan's war on Russia, Pepe Escobar, Sputnik. Escobar sums up Ankara's role in Syria as succinctly as anyone. Erdogan has been ISIS' best friend, of that there is little doubt. The problem that Turkey faces now is that the Russian-led coalition is rapidly destroying the infrastructure that provides funding for ISIS, oil refineries, fields, and transport, while gradually retaking territory that was formerly controlled by the many anti-regime or Al-Qaeda-linked groups in the north, west, and central parts of the country. In the last few days alone, Russia and company have concluded the encirclement of Syria's biggest city, Aleppo, vaporized a convoy of over 500 oil trucks in the vicinity of Raqqa, and intensified their bombing in the Turkmen Mountains, the Kurdish Mountains, and the Prophet Jonah Mountains. The coalition has moved as far north as Azaz, along the Turkish border, and recaptured the strategic Aleppo-Raqqa highway, which completely cuts off ISIS supply route from the east in Raqqa. All of the recent progress comes in the wake of the retaking of the strategic Kuwairis air base, which was the tipping point in the 4.5-year-long conflict. Now the Russian coalition has focused on closing the border, a move that will sever vital supply lines to pro-Turkish militias operating in Syria and force the terrorists to either flee or surrender. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov emphasized this point last week, saying, quote, "We are convinced that by blocking the border we will in many respects solve the tasks to eradicate terrorism on Syrian soil." Keep in mind that Erdogan is not the only one with designs on the so-called Afrin-Jarablus corridor, east of the Euphrates. Powerful politicians in the U.S., including John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton, and others, have all alluded to this area as the most suitable location for a no-fly zone. And, despite the fact that Obama refuses to send U.S. ground forces to fight in Syria, he has continued to fuel the conflict in other less conspicuous ways. Just last Wednesday, under the cover of the Thanksgiving holiday, when the media was preoccupied with other matters, Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act of 2016, which provides another $800 million in aid to armed extremists in Syria and Ukraine. The NDAA, which effectively prevents the closing down of U.S. concentration camp at Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, reflects Obama's determination to continue Washington's vicious policy in Syria, which has resulted in the deaths of more than 250,000 and the displacement of 11 million or more. This helps to explain why the Russian offensive has set alarms off in Washington. It's because the U.S. plan to establish a permanent staging ground for terrorists in North Syria is quickly going up in smoke. Bangkok-based geopolitical researcher and writer Tony Cartalucci explains exactly what's at stake for the warring parties in a brilliant piece at Global Research titled Humanitarian Supplies for the Islamic State ISIS, NATO's terror convoys halted at Syrian border. Here's an excerpt. Quote, Russia's increased activity along the Syrian-Turkish border signifies the closing phases of the Syrian conflict, with Syrian and Kurdish forces holding the border east of the Euphrates. The Afrin-Jarablus corridor is the only remaining conduit for supplies bound for terrorists in Syria to pass. When this corridor is closed and supplies cut off, ISIS, Nusra, and all associated NATO-backed factions will atrophy and die as the Syrian military restores order across the country. With the support being cut off and the prospect of these militants being eradicated, the true sponsors behind the conflict are moving more directly and overtly to salvage their failed conspiracy against the Syrian state. What we see emerging is what was suspected and even obvious all along, a proxy war started by and fought for Western hegemonic ambitions in the region, intentionally feeding the forces of extremism, not fighting them. Humanitarian supplies for the Islamic State ISIS, NATO's terror convoys halted at the Syrian border. Global Research. Seen in this light, Obama's recent request for Turkey to deploy 30,000 to seal the border on the Turkish side, see Wall Street Journal, should be viewed with extreme skepticism. Clearly, Washington has not relented in its Assad must-go policy at all. In fact, Obama reiterated that mantra less than a week ago. That means the Obama crew may be hoping that Turkish ground forces can succeed where his jihadi proxies failed. That is, that the 30,000 troops will be used to clear and hold a 60 by 20 mile stretch of Syrian territory that can be used as the proposed safe zone. All Turkey would need is a pretext to invade and a little bit of air cover from the U.S. Air Force. It wouldn't be the first time a false flag was used to start a war. The bottom line is this. Putin had better move quickly before Washington and Ankara get their ducks in a row and begin to mobilize. The time to seize the border is now. The U.S.-Russia proxy war in Syria. The risk of Syria becoming a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia became real last week when Turkey and Syrian jihadists used U.S.-supplied weaponry to shoot down a Russian warplane and rescue helicopter, killing 2 Russians, a danger that ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern explores. By Ray McGovern for Consortium News on Information Clearinghouse. December 1, 2015. Belatedly, at a sidebar meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Paris Climate Summit on Monday, President Barack Obama reportedly expressed regret for last week's killing of a Russian pilot who was shot down by a Turkish air-to-air missile fired by a U.S.-supplied F-16 and the subsequent death of a Russian Marine on a search and rescue mission, apparently killed by a U.S.-made TOW missile. But Obama administration officials continued to take the side of Turkey, a NATO ally which claims implausibility that it was simply defending its airspace, and that the Russian pilot of the Su-24 warplane had ignored repeated warnings. According to accounts based on Turkish data, the Su-24 may have strayed over a slice of Turkish territory for 17 seconds. See consortiumnews.com's facts back Russia on Turkish attack. Immediately after the incident on November 24, Obama offered a knee-jerk justification of Turkey's provocative action, which appears to have been a deliberate attack on a Russian warplane to deter continued bombing of Syrian jihadists, including the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, an Islamist, has supported various jihadists as his tip of the spear in his goal to overthrow the secular regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. In his first public comments about the Turkish attack, Obama gracelessly asserted Turkey's right to defend its territory and airspace, although there was never any indication that the Su-24, even if it had strayed momentarily into Turkish airspace, had any hostile intentions against Turkey. Indeed, Turkey and the United States were well aware that the Russian planes were targeting the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front, and other jihadist rebels. Putin even complained, quote, "We told our U.S. partners in advance where, when, and at what altitudes our pilots were going to operate. The U.S.-led coalition, which includes Turkey, was aware of the time and place where our planes would operate. And this is exactly where and when we were attacked. Why did we share this information with the Americans? Either they don't control their allies, or they just pass this information left and right without realizing what the consequences of such actions might be. We will have to have a serious talk with our U.S. partners." Putin also suggested that the Turkish attack was in retaliation for Russia's bombing of a truck convoy carrying Islamic State oil to Turkey. On Monday, on the sidelines of the Paris summit, Putin said Russia has, quote, "received additional information confirming that oil from the deposits controlled by Islamic State militants enters Turkish territory on industrial scale." Turkey's Erdogan, also in Paris, denied buying oil from terrorists and vowed to resign, quote, "if it is proven that we have in fact done so." Was Obama angry? In private, Obama may have been outraged by Erdogan's reckless actions, as some reports suggest, but if so, Obama seems publicly more afraid of offending the neocons, who dominate official Washington's opinion circles, and who hold key positions in his own administration, than of provoking a possible nuclear confrontation with Russia. On November 24, even as Russian emotions were running high reacting to the killing of one Russian pilot and the death of a second Russian Marine killed after his helicopter was shot down apparently by a U.S.-supplied TOW missile fired by Syrian jihadists, Obama chose to act tough against Putin, both during a White House press conference with French President François Hollande, and later with pro-Turkish remarks from U.S. officials. During the press conference after the Turkish shootdown and the deliberate fire from Turkish-backed Syrian jihadists, aiming at two Russian airmen as they parachuted to the ground, Obama chose to make disparaging remarks about the Russian president. Obama boasted about the 65 nations in the U.S.-led coalition against the Islamic State compared to Putin's small coalition of Russia and Iran, although Putin's tiny coalition appears to be much more serious and effective than Obama's bloated one, which includes countries such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar that have been implicated in supporting jihadist elements, including Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. By delivering these anti-Russian insults at such a delicate time, Obama apparently was trusting that Putin would keep his cool and tamp down public emotions at home, even as Obama lacked the integrity and courage to stand up to neocon criticism from the Washington Post's editorial page, or from some of his hawkish subordinates. The administration's neocons who keep demanding an escalation of tensions with Russia include Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs Victoria Nuland. Then there are the officials most identified with arms procurement, sales, and use, such as Defense Secretary Ashton Carter. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Joseph Dunford recently volunteered to Congress that U.S. forces, quote, can impose a no-fly zone for Syria, a dangerous play advocated by presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and Senator John McCain. Dunford is the same hawk who identified Russia as the, quote, existential threat to the U.S. and said it would be reasonable to send heavy weapons to Ukraine on Russia's border. Meanwhile, NATO Commander General Philip Breedlove keeps up his fly-by-the-pants information warfare campaign citing Russian, quote, aggression, quote, invasions, and planning to do still more evil things. One is tempted to dismiss him as a buffoon, but he is the NATO commander. Lack of control. It does not appear as though Obama has the same degree of control over foreign and defense policy that Putin enjoys in Moscow, or at least one hopes Putin can retain such control, since some hard-line Russian nationalists are fuming that Putin has been too accommodating of his Western, quote, partners. Perhaps the greatest danger from Obama's acquiescence to the neocons' new Cold War with Russia is that the neocon hopes for regime change in Moscow will be realized, except that Putin will be replaced by some ultra-nationalist who would rather risk nuclear war than accept further humiliation of Mother Russia. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the U.S. establishment is such that the generals, the arms manufacturers and weapons merchants, the Defense Department, and most of Congress have a very strong say in U.S. foreign policy, and Obama seems powerless to change it. The model of governing in Washington is a far cry from Russia's guiding principle of Edino-Nakhilayi, by which one supreme authority is in clear control of decision-making on defense and foreign policy. Even when Obama promises, he often fails to deliver. Think back to what Obama told then-President Dmitry Medvedev when they met in Seoul in March 2012 about addressing Russian concerns over European missile defense. In remarks picked up by camera crews, Obama asked for some space until after the U.S. election. Obama can be heard saying, quote, "This is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility." Yet, even after winning re-election, Obama has remained cowed by the influential neocons, even as he has bucked some of their more aggressive demands, such as a massive U.S. bombing campaign against Assad's military in summer 2013, and bombing Iran. Instead, in 2014 to 15, Obama pushed for a negotiated agreement to constrain Iran's nuclear program. Ideally, Obama should be able to show some flexibility on Syria during his last year in office, but no one should hold their breath. Obama appears to have deep fears about crossing the neocons or Israel regarding what they want for the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Besides the neocons' close ties to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the neocons are intimately connected to the interests of the military-industrial complex, which provides substantial funding for the major think tanks, where many neocons hang their hats and churn out new arguments for more world conflict and thus more military spending. Unlike Obama, Pope Francis addressed this fact of life head-on in his September 24 address to members of the U.S. Congress, many, if not most of whom, who are lavished with proceeds from the arms trade and then appropriate still more funding for arms production and sales. Quote, "Why are deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering?" Francis asked them face to face. Quote, "Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money, money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood." An old epithet. From my days as a CIA analyst covering the Soviet Union, I'm reminded of the epithet favored by the Soviet Party Daily Pravda a few decades ago. Quote, "Valstritskaye Krovotpisai," or Wall Street bloodsuckers. Propaganda-ish as that term seemed, it turns out that Soviet media were not far off on that subject. Indeed, the banks and corporations involved in arms manufacture and sales enjoy immense power, arguably more than a president, arguably more than Obama. The moneyed interests, including Congress, are calling the shots. The old adage, "money makes the world go round," is also apparent in Washington's velvet gloves treatment of the Saudis and is nowhere better illustrated than in the continued suppression of 28 pages of the 2002 Joint Congressional Inquiry on 9/11. Those pages deal with the Saudi role in financing and supporting some of the 9/11 hijackers, but both the Bush and Obama administrations have kept those pages hidden for 13 years. One reason is that the Saudis are the primary recipients of the U.S. trade in weapons, for which they pay cash. American manufacturers are selling the Saudis arms worth $100 billion under the current 5-year agreement. Oddly, acts of terrorism sweeten the pot. 3 days after the attacks in Paris, Washington and Riyadh announced a deal for $1.3 billion more. And yet neither Obama nor any of the candidates trying to replace him, nor Congress, is willing to jeopardize the arms trade by insisting that Riyadh call an abrupt halt to its support for the jihadists fighting in Syria for fear this might incur the wrath of the deep-pocket Saudis. Not even Germany, already inundated so far this year by a flood of 950,000 refugees, mostly from Syria, is willing to risk Saudi displeasure. Berlin prefers to pay off the Turks with billions of euros to staunch the flow of those seeking refuge in Europe. And so, an unholy alliance of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states continues to fuel the war in Syria while Obama pretends that his giant coalition is really doing the job of taking on many of those same jihadists. But Obama's coalition has been woefully incompetent and indeed compromised, bumbling along and letting the Islamic State seize more territory along with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and allies. Russia's entry into the war in September changed the equation because, unlike Obama's grand coalition, Putin's puny coalition with Iran actually was serious about beating back the jihadists and stabilizing Assad's regime. Turkey's shoot-down of the Russian warplane on November 24 was a crude message from Erdogan that success in defeating the jihadists would not be tolerated. As for the United States and Europe, myopia prevails. None seems concerned that the terrorists whom they support daily will come back to bite them tomorrow. American officials, despite their rhetoric and despite 9/11, seem to consider the terrorist threat remote from U.S. shores and, in any case, dwarfed in importance by the lucrative arms sales. As for the Vienna talks on Syria, the speed with which they were arranged, with Iran taking part, raised expectations now dampened. Last week, for example, Secretary of State John Kerry bragged about how a meeting of, quote, moderate rebels is to convene, quote, in the next few weeks to come up with principles for negotiating with Syrian President Assad's government. The convener, Saudi Arabia. Obama knows what has to happen for this terrorist threat to be truly addressed. The Saudis and Turks have to be told, in no uncertain terms, to stop supporting the jihadists. But that would require extraordinary courage and huge political, perhaps even physical, risk. There is no sign that President Obama dares bite that bullet. Sputnik News interviews Sakar. Is Turkey waging war on Russia in Crimea, the Caucasus, and Central Asia? By Ekaterina Blinova. For the Sakar, on Information Clearinghouse. December 1, 2015. What is taking place today is a battle for global dominance waged by major Western geopolitical players, and what is at stake here is the future of our planet. An anonymous U.S. analyst who goes by the name The Sakar told Sputnik. As for Daesh, it is simply a weapon, he adds. Putin plays waiting game as NATO presses self-destruct button during the Paris Climate Change Conference. COP21, Russian President Putin revealed that Moscow has evidence confirming that the Russian Su-24 bomber was shot down by Turkey in order to protect oil deliveries from Daesh, ISIS, adding that oil from Daesh-occupied fields has been transferred to Turkey on an industrial scale. But is it possible that Turkey is selling the stolen oil without Washington's knowledge? Are the Turkish officials who are responsible for oil smuggling acting alone, or are they backed by some influential oil market players? Quote, U.S. intelligence agencies suffer from many weaknesses, but being unable to track money movements is not one of them. The Sakar, an anonymous top-level American military analyst, told Sputnik in an exclusive interview, quote, furthermore, both the USA and Israel have an extensive network for agents in Turkey. I thus consider it extremely unlikely that anybody in Turkey would be able to move around large sums of money without the U.S. being fully aware of that. Also consider that Daesh is a top priority target for U.S. intelligence agencies, and that their immense data collection capabilities are also focused on the Daesh side of the equation, he emphasized. Quote, finally, the Sakar added, quote, the illegal sale of oil is a minor element in a much more important battle between the USA and the Russia-Iran-Syria alliance, and, thus, the U.S. would never allow it to interfere with its bigger objectives. The analyst underscored that corruption has long been an integral part of the U.S. imperial system. Quote, corruption being one key figure of the U.S. empire. It is normal for the U.S. deep state to allow its local puppets to engage in profitable war profiteering, but only as long as this does not interfere with the global U.S. strategy, he stressed. Experts call attention to the fact that the shooting down of the Su-24 could have been Turkish President Erdogan's act of revenge, given the fact that his family has reportedly been involved in Daesh's oil smuggling business. In his recent interview with the Radio Sputnik's Middle East analyst Stanislav Tarasov, noted that, quote, Erdogan's family is directly involved in the incident, and suggested that, quote, we could soon learn that President Erdogan himself is directly linked to ISIL. But was the downing of the Su-24 bomber by the Turkish F-16 fighter a lone wolf operation or a pre-planned action coordinated by NATO and Washington? If so, what goal does NATO-Washington have in mind? Quote, the downing of the Su-24 was definitely a major and carefully planned ambush operation which involved a large number of Turkish F-16 constantly held on airborne alert positions. The notion that the Americans did not know about this all along is ridiculous. The sacker elaborated. Putin, Russia has evidence Su-24 shot down to protect Daesh oil deliveries. Quote, make no mistake, this was an act of war by the USA and NATO, but executed in such a manner as to provide the real culprits some degree of plausible deniability. The hope was to have Russia overreact and trigger a direct confrontation which could then be blamed on Russia. You have to keep in mind that the Russian force in Syria is a very small one and that it is vulnerable even with 60-plus combat aircraft and S-400s. The Russian force is much smaller than the Turkish Air Force, which has well over 200 F-16s. The USA is now using this vulnerability to provoke Russia, the analyst told Sputnik. The sacker noted that the Turks themselves had violated the Syrian and especially Greek airspace hundreds of times, quote, and not just once for 17 seconds. In the wake of the incident, Ankara suggested that the alleged intrusion of the Russian Su-24 into Turkish airspace had lasted a mere 17 seconds. Quote, the very fact that they actually used this 17 seconds excuse is by itself a clear provocation designed to humiliate Russia and trigger an overreaction. Thank God Putin and the Kremlin did not take this bait, the sacker underscored. Interestingly enough, the incident in Syrian airspace had been preceded by an act of sabotage in Ukraine. On November 20, unidentified saboteurs blew up the main power lines in Ukraine leading into Crimea. Crimean Tatar activists blocked access to fallen lines. Given the close ties between Ankara and Crimean Tatars, Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu is reportedly of Crimean Tatar descent himself. The question arises whether the two actions were connected in any way. Quote, I have no information showing any links, but what is clear is that Turkey is waging its own mini-war of influence against Russia, not only in Crimea but also in the Caucasus and Central Asia. The sacker told Sputnik, commenting on the issue. Remarkably, in 2001, then modest academic Dr. Ahmet Davutoglu published a book entitled Strategic Depth. In his book, Davutoglu suggested that Turkey possesses a unique, quote, strategic depth due to its historical and geographical position. The would-be Turkish Prime Minister argued that Turkey should simultaneously exercise its influence in the Middle East, the Balkan region, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, as well as in the Caspian, Mediterranean, Black Sea zones. According to Davutoglu, Turkey should re-establish its role as a global player, not just a regional power. In some sense, Davutoglu viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union as a historic chance for Turkey to expand its influence in the Caucasus region and Central Asia. And here enters Daesh. Given the fact that ISIL has been created and fueled by a number of states and private donors, which geopolitical players are resisting Russia's attempts to eradicate terrorism in the region and preserve the sovereignty of Syria. Is Russia confronting a bunch of terrorists fed by Saudi and Qatari sheiks, or some well-organized multinational organizations? Quote, as for Daesh, it is simply one weapon used by the U.S. empire to destroy its opponents. There is no such thing as terrorism by itself. It is always the weapon used by one or several state actors, the sacker explained. Quote, the sheiks you mentioned are just pawns in the hands of the deep state, which runs the U.S. Anglo-Zionist empire, and they themselves only have a local influence. Thus, the Saudis or the Qatari are major players in Syria, but already at the Middle Eastern level, they are far less powerful than, say, the Turks or the Israelis. And while they can act as private donors and support and sponsors of this or that faction of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, They can only do that as long as the Americans tolerate that. One could say that the local sheiks are influential or even powerful puppets, but they still remain fundamentally puppets, the U.S. military analyst told Sputnik. However, he claims, this is only the tip of the iceberg. The situation in general is far more serious. Quote, what is taking place today is a world war between, on one hand, the so-called West, the U.S. empire, and what I call the resistance, i.e. Russia, China, the BRICS, the SCO countries, Latin America, etc. What is at stake here is the future of our planet. It will either be ruled by a single world hegemon, or it will be organized as a multipolar world. The events in the Middle East are just one front in this worldwide war, and the war in Syria just one battle in the Middle Eastern front, the Sacker concluded.